The red-hot iron inserted into his body whispered through the centuries, a brutal act that left no marks. On September 21, 1327, the cold, unforgiving stone walls of Berkeley Castle stood silent, bearing witness to one of the most grisly murders in European history. A 43-year-old man, once a king, now lay broken and battered in a dimly lit cell. His beard, now graying with age, and his eyes, dimmed from years of cruelty and despair, seemed to carry the weight of a fallen empire. His wrists and ankles bore deep, raw marks from heavy chains, the kind reserved for those whose very existence had been condemned to oblivion. His face was twisted in humiliation and pain, a reflection of the life he had once known and the royal blood that no longer held any power. This was Edward II of England, a man who had once ruled with authority, but now lay forgotten. A prisoner of his own kingdom, the world had moved on, leaving behind only whispers of his reign. On that fateful night, two figures crept into his prison cell, their footsteps echoing through the stone corridors, a harbinger of the horror to come. In their hands, they carried a medieval instrument of torture, a red-hot iron, glowing like an omen from the abyss. What followed was an execution so vile, so brutally crafted, it would become etched in history as a testament to the darkest corners of human cruelty. Bound and helpless, Edward was subjected to unimaginable suffering. A horn tube was cruelly forced into his body, and through it, the searing iron was introduced, burning his insides without a trace. On his skin, his agonized screams were swallowed by pillows, a grotesque attempt to muffle the sounds of a king's final breath. The next morning, the lifeless body of the former monarch was found, his face contorted in a grotesque mask of pain. The official cause of death, natural causes, they claimed, but who would believe it? This version of Edward II's death, immortalized in stories and legends, paints a picture of a tyrant receiving his due punishment, a king whose supposed sins, his alleged homosexual relationships, were repaid in the most horrific way imaginable. But was it true? Did the story unfold as history claims, or is there something darker lurking beneath the surface? To understand the truth, we must delve into the twisted life of this controversial monarch. Born on April 25, 1284, in the rugged lands of Caernarfon, Wales, Edward was the fourth son of the mighty Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. Edward II, however, was anything but his father's son. A man of quiet passions, he was drawn to activities considered beneath a king, swimming, crafting, and mingling with those of lower station. His rejection of the chivalric ideals that his father held dear enraged the old king. In one violent outburst, Edward I tore handfuls of his son's hair out when the young prince dared to request a title for his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a man who would become the dark heart of Edward's tragic fate. When Edward I died in 1307, his son ascended the throne at the age of 23, taking the name Edward II. But from the very beginning, his reign was marked by weakness, folly, and a fatal obsession with his controversial friend, Gaveston. Their bond would set in motion a series of events that would unravel the kingdom and lead to Edward II's horrifying demise, forever sealing his place in the annals of history. And so, the legend of Edward II began, one steeped in darkness, betrayal, and an eerie sense of foreboding that would linger for centuries to come. One of Edward II's first acts as king was to summon Piers Gaveston, the man his father had exiled, and grant him the unthinkable and elevated title, Earl of Cornwall, usually reserved for royalty. But this act, in the eyes of the nobility, was an affront of the highest order. Not only did Edward bestow Gaveston with this prestigious title, but he also entrusted him with royal treasures, gifts meant for his own people. During the coronation, Gaveston was given the unimaginable privilege of carrying St. Edward's crown, a right reserved only for the royal bloodline. Whispers quickly spread, and rumors about their bond grew more intense, more disturbing. Chroniclers, carefully choosing their words, describe how the king loved Gaveston beyond measure, as if bound by a pact of unbreakable love. Some historians argue that this reflected the ideals of male friendship held in the medieval court, but others, more daring, pointed to a darker interpretation, one that painted Edward and Gaveston's connection in a more forbidden light. A bishop in 1334 even went so far as to accuse Edward of sodomy, a damning term in those times. The political consequences were devastating. In 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, yet his attention was fixed entirely on Gaveston, neglecting his young wife. Worse still, jewels intended for Isabella ended up in Gaveston's hands, humbling the queen. Then only 12 years old, the nobility, led by Edward's cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, demanded Gaveston's exile. But the king, driven by his obsession, brought Gaveston back. The cycle of exile and return culminated in 1312, when the barons captured Gaveston. His execution was swift, brutal, stabbed and beheaded at the roadside. Edward swore revenge, but was forced to reconcile, his anger drowned in the shadow of tragedy. Edward II's reign descended into a nightmare, haunted by relentless failures that would doom him and his kingdom. On the battlefield, he suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, his army shattered by the Scots. The territories his father had fought so hard to conquer slipped away, like sand through desperate fingers. But it wasn't just on the battlefield that Edward faltered. As a king, he proved woefully incompetent, allowing the royal treasury to drain away, the wealth of England disappearing with each passing day, as though cursed by some dark force. Politically, Edward's decisions were disastrous. After Gaveston's death, he repeated his earlier folly, elevating another of his favorites, Hugh Despenser the Younger, to an even greater position of power. The Despensers' father and son quickly became the true rulers of England, using their grip on the king to amass wealth and land, crushing their enemies with the brutal efficiency of the sword and the confiscation of their estates. But in the shadows of the court, a storm was brewing, and it was Queen Isabella, once the young bride of Edward, who would become the tempest that shattered his reign. Now a woman of power, her resentment had festered for years. She seethed with hatred for the Despensers and, by extension, for her own husband. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission, but she refused to return, her pride and fury keeping her from the man who had wronged her. Worse still, in France, she took a lover, the exiled Roger Mortimer, a man who had escaped the Tower of London and swore vengeance against Edward and his treacherous favorites. The Queen's betrayal would ignite the flames of rebellion that would consume the kingdom. In September of 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer arrived in England with a small but determined army. To Edward's horror, they were greeted not with resistance, but with open arms. Nobles and commoners alike saw them as liberators, and Edward's once proud reign began to crumble. The king, along with his loyal Despensers, fled westward, but it was futile. Soon, they were captured. What followed was a nightmare of brutal retribution. Hugh Despenser the Younger was dragged through the streets by horses, his body broken and humiliated. He was hanged from a gallows towering 15 meters high. But before he could die, his torment was only beginning. Castrated, he watched in agony as his genitals were burned before his eyes. His intestines were ripped from his body, ignited, and burned as he still clung to life. The final act of this public execution was his beheading, and his severed head was paraded on London Bridge for all to see. As for Edward, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. In January of 1327, his imprisonment began in relative comfort, but soon his treatment grew crueler. Locked away in Berkeley Castle, his physical and mental torment escalated. The goal was simple: break him down until death came naturally. But Edward defied his captors. His survival sparked rumors of a rescue, leading to a darker fate. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. One subscribe from you will be a huge encouragement for us to grow the channel and create even better content in the future. Thank you so much to all the brothers. On September 21st, 1327, in the cold, stone walls of Berkeley Castle, a shadowy event took place that would haunt English history forever. The night echoed with whispers of a king's tragic end. Edward II, once a mighty ruler of England, found himself imprisoned, abandoned by those he had once trusted. His life, once filled with power and luxury, now teetered on the edge of a dark and twisted fate. The king, now broken, had been captured by the very forces he had once commanded. Yet, what transpired that night remains one of the most debated and gruesome moments in history. The most famous version of Edward's death is a horrific tale that would send chills down the spine of any listener. According to medieval chronicles, the deposed king was murdered in a most cruel and macabre way. The most prominent account of this grisly death comes from Geoffrey le Baker, written around 1350. He described the chilling details of Edward's execution, which left no visible marks on his body yet caused excruciating pain. A red-hot iron, the weapon of choice, was inserted into Edward's body through a horn tube. It burned him from the inside out, yet no scars appeared on his flesh. His screams, muffled by the cold, hard stone of the castle and the pillows pressed against his face, went unheard. This gruesome method left Edward suffering in silence, his body destroyed from within, while the world outside remained oblivious to his agony. Yet, historians and scholars have long questioned the truth of this story. Some argue that it is nothing more than a fabrication, designed to further demonize Edward's murderers and further vilify his reign. The story of the hot iron may have been a piece of propaganda, crafted during the reign of his son, Edward III, in an attempt to solidify his own power. The theory suggests that this brutal tale served not only to tarnish the memory of those who had deposed Edward II, but also to create a symbolic link between the execution method and Edward's alleged sexual activities, particularly his relationships with men. This narrative, though horrifying, may have been more about crafting a legend that played on the fears and biases of the time. More conventional methods of execution would have been far more likely, some scholars argue. Suffocation with pillows, a silent and unseen death, would leave no visible traces, just as the chronicles described. This theory posits that Edward's death was not a result of the gruesome red-hot iron execution, but rather a quiet, almost invisible killing, one that spared Isabella and Mortimer the guilt of directly participating in his demise. The dark, twisted beauty of this theory lies in its chilling simplicity. A king, once revered, suffocated in the shadows, erased from history with no trace but the darkness surrounding him. However, there is yet another layer to this mystery. The Fies Letter, an extraordinary document delivered to King Edward III in 1333, casts even more doubt on the official account of Edward II's death. The letter came from a mysterious Italian cleric named Manuel Fieschi, who claimed to have heard the confession of Edward II years after his supposed death. According to Fieschi, the king had escaped Berkeley Castle, leaving behind the body of a porter to take his place. This letter suggested that Edward was alive, living in secret, and had fled to Europe. The story became even more tantalizing when, in 1338, a man calling himself William the Welshman appeared at the court of the Holy Roman Empire in Koblenz, claiming to be none other than Edward II himself. The man's arrival sent shockwaves through Europe, yet most historians dismissed this claim as a fanciful hoax. But the possibility remained: could Edward have survived his imprisonment, vanishing from history to live a life in the shadows? Regardless of the truth behind these wild claims, what is certain is that a royal funeral for Edward II was held in December of 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral. His elaborate tomb still stands to this day, a stark reminder of a man who once ruled an empire, but ended his life as a forgotten prisoner. The body that was interred there was embalmed, making it difficult to identify any signs of trauma or cause of death. For centuries, it has remained a mystery whether the body in that tomb was truly Edward II's or an impostor. Edward III, his son, later took power in 1330, executing those who were believed to be responsible for his father's death. Gurney and Maltravers, two of Edward II's former captors, were either executed or exiled, further deepening the mystery surrounding Edward's demise. The legend of Edward II's death, whether true or not, had a profound impact on English culture. Christopher Marlowe, the famous playwright of the late 16th century, based his play Edward II on these events, depicting the king as a tragic victim, whose passions and personal relationships led to his downfall. Marlowe's portrayal emphasized the King's emotional vulnerability, painting a picture of a ruler undone by his desires and his alliances with controversial figures. Although Marlowe did not explicitly describe the method of Edward's death in his play, productions frequently included the infamous red-hot iron scene, further embedding it in the public imagination. The gruesome image of Edward's death became inextricably linked to his legacy, ensuring that his story would be remembered as one of the most tragic and horrific in history. Edward II's case is particularly significant because it represented one of the first instances of the formal deposition of a crowned English monarch. His forced removal from the throne set a dangerous precedent that would be followed in subsequent centuries with kings such as Richard II and Henry VI. Edward's deposition shattered the traditional view that monarchs ruled by divine right. His fate fundamentally challenged the idea that kings could not be overthrown by their own people, a notion that had been ingrained in medieval society. Moreover, Edward's downfall became a cautionary tale, one that was repeated throughout history. The idea that a ruler's personal desires, particularly those deemed transgressive or immoral by society, could lead to political ruin persisted in European culture for centuries. This narrative of moral and political failure would be used to explain the downfall of other monarchs, such as James I of England and Henry III of France, whose sexual behaviors were similarly scrutinized. Edward's story, whether through his tragic death or his potential survival in the shadows, serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing personal passions to overshadow the responsibilities of leadership. Today, nearly 7 centuries after his death, Edward II's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral remains a place of fascination. The alabaster effigy, serene and majestic, contrasts sharply with the horrific tales of his demise. It stands as a silent witness to a man whose life and death were defined by contradictions, a monarch who wielded absolute power, but ended his days as one of the most powerless men in history. The eerie contrast between the dignity of his tomb and the terror of the legends surrounding him serves as the perfect epilogue for a life that continues to captivate the imagination, urging us to reflect on the fine line between glory and ruin. The tragic story of Edward II serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of betrayal, ambition, and unchecked desire. His downfall wasn't just a result of his actions, but of a society that allowed personal passions to eclipse duty and leadership. As we reflect on his fate, let it be a lesson in the importance of loyalty, the dangers of favoritism, and the weight of power in our own lives. We must strive to balance personal desires with responsibility, remembering that our choices shape not just our destiny, but the lives of those around us.